Good afternoon, everyone. We're just going to wait sort of one more minute to let a few people just join, and then we'll kick things off. Okay, so good afternoon, everyone. Estelle and I have swapped roles for a change, so it is my pleasure this time to welcome you all to this month's House Percival Housing Snapshot webinar. And this time we will be delving into the key points for the sector that came out of the recent budget from the Labour government. This is the Labour government that has promised in its manifesto to build 1.5 million homes over the course of this Parliament. But before we delve any further, a quick reminder of who we are. And the eagle-eyed amongst you will see some unfamiliar faces on the screens in front of you, as we have recently welcomed Evie Utting as a paralegal in our social housing property team. Joe Redman and Harriet Green have also joined Simon Murphy's housing management practice as an associate solicitor and apprentice paralegal, respectively. So even more contacts for you to utilise for all of your social housing needs. But this isn't a sales pitch, of course, so we'll move on to the topic in hand. Oh, whoops. God, how did that get in there? Note to presenter, keep on screen for as long as you can get away with. Oh, I shouldn't have said that. Okay, moving swiftly on. There will be an opportunity to ask questions at the end of the webinar. So if you'd like to ask anything, please use the question and answer function. If you have any technical difficulties at any stage during the webinar, please let us know using the chat function and we'll try and help. So it probably didn't escape anyone's attention that Rachel Reeves, Chancellor of the Exchequer, delivered her first budget on the 30th of October. And within it, we heard some fairly big numbers. An investment of £5 billion in house building in the next year, an increase in the Affordable Homes Programme's budget by £500 million next year, and a pledge to provide £3 billion of support to SME house builders and the build-to-rent sector in the form of housing guarantee schemes. But to balance it all out, we also are going to see an increase in capital gains tax, an increase in the stamp duty land tax surcharge on second homes, and an increase to 15% in employer contributions to national insurance from April 2025, which for our sector may cause some alarm, particularly for those organisations who provide care and support services. But in this snapshot, we're going to hone in on the three big topics for HAs before sneaking in a quick update on some capital funding guide changes at the end. First up, Katie will look at changes to the right to buy discounts.
Thanks, JP. So one of the biggest changes to come out of the autumn budget was the reduction in right to buy discounts. Now, as you're all aware, right to buy was introduced in the 1980s as a way for tenants of local authorities to access home ownership. In 2012, right to buy cash discounts were increased to a high new level of £73,000 nationally and £100,000 in London, with discounts then rising in accordance with CPI each year. Now, the current maximum discounts are 136,400 in London and 102,400 in the rest of the country. And at the same time as these increases in 2012, councils were set with this one-to-one replacement target to make sure that the homes being lost through right to buy were then being rebuilt again so the stock wasn't being diminished. Now, over the years, a large discount meant more people were being able to buy the homes via right to buy, and it was creating rather negative effects, with the main issue being that the housing stock just wasn't being replenished quickly enough. Um, there's been quite a lot of data following the budget of this loss. We'll go through some of those figures now. So since Right to Buy was introduced, over 2 million council homes alone have been sold through the scheme. In a 12-year period between April 2012 and March 2024, there were over 124,000 Right to Buy sales, where only 48,000 homes were being replaced. In the northwest of England, over 4,300 council homes were sold off via Right to Buy in the last 10 years, with the receipts only going towards building or buying just over 1,400 homes in the same period. Now, that same region has over 200,000 people waiting on its social housing list. And then Greater Manchester recently have announced figures that they've lost 500 new build homes alone through Right to Buy in 2022. Now, the lack of available social housing and funding within these high right to buy discounts meant that there's just not enough housing stock available. And nationally, there's 1.27 million people on the social housing waiting list, with 150,000 children in this figure currently living in temporary accommodation. Now, in response to this, the Labour government spoke with local authorities, social housing providers, and Shelter to address the issue. And in their autumn budget, they announced that they would reduce the right to buy discounts back to their pre 2012 levels. Next slide, JP, please. Now, these new right to buy discounts are going to be introduced via the Housing Right to Buy Limits on Discount England Order 2024, which comes into force from the 21st of November, so very quickly. On screen, you will see a snip of the new maximum discount figures per region, and these discounts are not rising in line with CPI anymore. This is the maximum that people are going to be able to achieve. Although many of you on the screen will note that Eastern England remains one of the highest areas outside of London, save for the southeast. Now, obviously, the figures shown online are just the maximum discounts available and will be subject to other factors such as eligibility, previous discounts, and cost floor rules. By these changes, the Labour government suggests that it will reduce right to buy sales by over 25,000 over the next 5 years, meaning these homes will now stay in the social rented sector. And this sort of equates to around 1,700 right to buy sales a year successfully going through, which is a significant decrease compared to what we've seen over the last 10 years. In addition to the discount, the 2024 order is also increasing the cost floor period from 15 years to 30 years. Now, to recap, the cost floor limits the discount on right to buy properties to ensure that the purchase price doesn't fall below the cost of building, maintaining it, and repairing it. So the times increase from 15 years to 30 years for property built or acquired after the 1st of April 2012. The current policy suggests that the cost floor for preserved right to buy properties is going to remain at the 15-year level. Now, obviously, the reduction in discounts is huge, but the government has noted that this is going to be kept under review to ensure that the right balance is maintained between protecting stock and enabling tenants to still access home ownership. Parliament is going to provide an update end of 2026, early 2027 to see if any of these discount levels need to be revised. Now, there have been less right to buy sales in the last year. The 2023 to 2024 figures suggest there's only been just over 6,000 eligible sales through right to buy, which obviously is a 40% discount from the previous year. This could be due to the difficult economic position people are in and due to the rationing of housing stock. However, given the substantial decrease in right to buy discounts that are shortly coming into effect, we suspect that many housing associations and local authorities will be, if they haven't already, faced with a potential flurry of right to buy applications by tenants that are seeking to achieve these high discounts before the reduction comes into force on the 21st of November. Next slide, please, JP. In addition to the change in right to buy discounts, the government is allowing councils to keep 100% of the right to buy receipt. Previously, from 2012, the level of local authority receipts available to fund replacement housing was subject to a discount that had to be passed on to tenants, as well as administration costs, paying down any debts as well, and then a large portion was going to the Treasury. This meant that the higher the discount, the less capital the council would actually see to reinvest into replacement of the housing stock. figures coming out from the government consultation report and policies is that on average, the total going to HM Treasury from these right to buy receipts was totaling £183 million a year. This matched with the higher discounts means that, as I've noted already, replacement stock just hasn't been available. Council Housing Roundtable has noted in the recent policy and consultation that it's costing them up to 3 times as much as what the receipt they are getting to replace homes, so significant difference in available funding. Now, the government, in light of this, has confirmed that councils can keep 100% of their receipts. In addition to some of the flexibilities they've recently provided, means that councils should have more money available to them to replace the lost housing stock. Various figures have been released with Inside Housing quoting that it should take the council should save over £1 billion, over the next 5 years onwards from the combination of these reforms proposed to help address the housing issues. While some argue that the money generated from right to buy sales will obviously be used to invest in other forms and avenues of producing housing, but the right to buy receipts themselves, even at 100% retention, isn't sufficient alone to help tackle this housing stock loss and to begin to fill the void that's already there. Blackpool Council have commented following Labour's proposed reforms, there's still a vast amount of red tape in spending these receipts, and that there's still room for further improvement, that they need to see the government action to really benefit from this. Next slide, please, JP. Thank you. Now, whilst the reduction in right to buy discounts will be welcomed by many, and especially those where the need for social housing is greater than ever, some say reform needs to go further. Angela Rayner, as you'll see on screen, has recently announced that the government are looking to put in further protection and restrictions on new build social homes so this stock isn't being immediately lost. And she's further admitted that the system does need to be fairer. A public consultation is being launched shortly, seeking views on wider reforms to the right to buy scheme to further support to the government's objective, and I quote, achieving a sustainable scheme that enables long-standing tenants to buy, protects new build stock, represents good value for money, enables council to develop their capacity to build new homes. Now, as we've touched on, the Right to Buy scheme is a great opportunity for many people to access their home. As we're all aware, Angela Rayner brought her home through the scheme in 2007 and then sold it for a £40,000 profit 8 years later. So it is beneficial for a lot of people. So the government will need to think carefully about maintaining this correct balance between giving tenants an avenue to home ownership whilst maintaining the housing stock and producing this much well-needed cash for councils. Next slide, please, JP. And now on screen, there's a variety of links to be available afterwards for you to have a look through. The government's policy paper can be reviewed online, which is linked, as well as the updated guidance for tenants and guidance to local authorities. You would look through this in much more detail. It looks like right to buy discounts is just, the reduction in right to buy discounts is just the start of change in this area, and that reform is going to keep going. And we suspect that the policy of right to buy that was produced in the 1980s will be very different to what it's going to be at the end of this parliament. But we will continue to keep you updated as and when reform continues to be announced, when this consultation becomes available. I'll now pass over to Estelle, who's going to take you through rent settlement.
Thanks, Katie. As Katie touched on there, the deadline for applications to get the current discount is 21st of November. So a little bit of a plug for our services. If you are finding yourselves overwhelmed with applications, please do get in contact and we'll see if we can do to help you out. So moving on to the rent settlement. So this element of the budget was not unexpected. Like many of the things in the budget, it had been heavily trailed in advance. Although broadly welcomed by the sector, there had been a bit of an anticipation that we were going to see a 10-year rent settlement rather than the 5 years that was announced by Rachel Reeves in her budget speech last month. Next slide, please, JP. The details of the proposals from the government are contained in a future social housing rent policy document, which is also the consultation document, and that was published on Budget Day, and I'll have a link to it later in the slides. The headlines from that policy paper are basically that not really that much is changing. We're sticking with the status quo, which is CPI, Consumer Price Index, plus 1% cap on rent increases for potentially a further 5-year period from April 2026. This isn't a major shake-up of rent policies, as some commentators had wanted. The current rent policy isn't really changing, other than what the government has described as minor and technical changes. As is the position now, this rent settlement will only apply to social rent and affordable rents. So social rents being those rents that are set subject to the formula rents, and they're generally seen as being the lowest rents, and affordable rents being those rents that are not more than 80% of market. Shared ownership rents under new grant-funded leases are also subject to CPI plus 1% caps on rent increases, but this is a Homes England requirement and is not part of the rent settlement. Shared ownership is outside the scope of the rent settlement, as is intermediate rent, specialist supported housing rent, temporary supported housing rent, and care homes. To give you some idea of what a CPI plus 1% rent increase cap will look like over the next few years, I've put on screen the Office for Budget Responsibility's predictions for CPI inflation from now until 2029. And you'll see that they're predicting a much more stable increase compared to what we've seen in the past few years. And particularly, there's no return predicted here to that double-digit increase we saw in 2022. What's important to note at the moment is that all of this is an intention only and is subject to consultation, and there have to be further government steps to bring all of this into effect. Next slide, please. To put all of this in a bit more context, I've got a slide up there with a brief overview of sort of the history of rent control since 2001. So 2001 saw the introduction of formula rent for social rent. Then between 2002 to 2015, there were rent increases which were based on RPI plus 0.5%. And there was this policy of rent convergence for social rent. So that meant that RPs could charge extra above the RPI cap on those social rents that had fallen behind on the formula rent to kind of bring everything up to the same level. 2011 saw the introduction of affordable rent. Then 2016 to 2020, there was a big change and rents were reduced by 1% each year. And then the current system of CPI plus 1% came in 2020. But of course, we did see in 2023 that there was the 7% cap due to the high inflation CPI rate that I spoke about just now. So looking at the kind of the regulatory process and the bigger regulatory picture, the government controls initial rents set by registered providers and any increases to those rents through the regulator of social housing. And the legislative framework for that is found in the Housing and Regeneration Act 2008, and in particular, Section 197. And that gives the Secretary of State the power to direct the regulator to set standards and to direct the contents and objectives of those standards. And those standards, as we know, include rent standard. Before giving a direction to the regulator, the Secretary of State must consult various bodies, including those representing registered providers. Following that consultation, the government will issue the formal direction on rent together with the accompanying policy statement. The regulator for social housing then does another consultation before issuing the final rent standard. And that rent standard is a document that must be complied with by all registered providers of social housing, and that includes registered local authorities. I've also put on the slide the timeline for the current process. So the consultation was published on Budget Day, and that closes at 11:45 on the 23rd of December. So, time to get your consultation responses in before your Christmas break. Then the government has said that the next stage will happen in 2025. So once the consultation has closed, the government will issue the new direction and policy statement to the regulator. The regulator will consult on that and will then issue the new rent standard. And then the first rent increase under the new rent standard will be from 1st of April 2026. And if we are sticking with the 5-year rent settlement, then we'll see the new rent settlement in 1 April 2031. The consultation document actually makes for quite interesting reading. I say that, I know I'm a housing nerd, but it was quite interesting going through the detail because it goes a lot into the background around rents and the government's policy aims. And the policy aims aren't really anything new, but they do highlight the balancing act when it comes to rent increases. So what the government has said is that it aims to improve the supply and quality of rented social housing while ensuring those homes are affordable to those who need them. So there's two limbs, to the policy aim for providers, and that's increasing supply as well as improving quality. And that kind of begs the question, I think, the bit about increasing supply is, should social tenants be paying through their rent for the supply of new homes? And to be fair, the government consultation does kind of address that quandary to some extent, because it says that tenants have the right to expect that management and maintenance of their homes will be the priority use of the rent they pay. But the government also acknowledges that registered providers' expectations about future rental income, that underpins the business plan, and that strongly influences the financial capacities that RPs have to deliver new homes. So it's not as straightforward. In terms of the cost challenges of management and maintenance, there is perhaps some comfort for RPs in the consultation, because the government does recognise that they do need to provide some clarity, not just on the rent settlement, but on upcoming regulatory requirements to help housing associations, RPs, with their financial planning. So the sort of things they're talking about in there, where we've been waiting for some clarity for some time now, is the new Decent Homes Standard, new minimum energy efficiency standards for social rented homes, implementation of AUAB's law, the new competence and conduct standard, and the new access to information requirements, because all of these things are going to increase costs that will need to be covered through rents. Another interesting question that the consultation paper discusses is why, if CPI is a measure of inflation, the rent settlement is above inflation. And there's some interesting figures in there. The government estimates that a flat CPI increase compared to CPI plus 1% would result in RPs receiving £2.7 billion less in rental income over the first 4 years of the policy. I mean, that is a huge number. And so ultimately, the government's conclusion was that CPI would flat CPI would be insufficient income for RPs to undertake necessary improvements to existing stock, and would ultimately lead to further scaling back in development programmes. Balancing that against the government's other aim of affordability, of course, the paper makes much of the fact that 2/3 of rent in the social sector is paid by housing benefit or universal credit. So increases in rent would not actually impact on the disposable income of many tenants. They then make a bit more of a spurious argument about those tenants who would be affected, saying that they would benefit from improved homes and energy efficiencies. There was much talk before the budget about a 10-year rent settlement, and both NHF and CIH were advocating for that longer term certainty. The government again addresses this in the policy paper and basically says that a 5-year policy is more credible and therefore should give the sector more confidence that it will actually be adhered to this time. And that is, of course, a bit of a reflection on the previous promises that have been broken on rent settlements. However, and this is very important, the 5-year period is not necessarily fixed. The consultation specifically asks for views on a 7-year settlement or a 10-year settlement or a rolling 5-year settlement. So the rolling thing is where the settlement will be updated every 5 years. So there's no kind of cliff edge end to it. And providers will always know what the next 5 years will look like. There have been arguments made for more radical changes to rent policies. For example, going back to the rent conversions policy we looked at briefly earlier. Also, possibility of setting rents outside of government, having an independent body, completely rewriting the social rent formula because it dates back to 1999 now. The government talks about this in the consultation paper, but says ultimately that would create more uncertainty and instability and would not help the government to meet its housing aims. So to sum up, the proposal is CPI plus 1% for 5 years, rent increase cap, but that is subject to consultation. The mood is you shouldn't expect the consultation to result in any significant changes, but there could be tweaks to the duration of the settlement out there to be won. If you've got any views on it, don't forget to respond to the consultation. There's a link on the screen for that, which will come out later when we circulate the slides. I've also put in some links to the draft rent standard documents and policy statement and the existing rent directions and policy statement. And on that, I shall hand back to JP.
Thanks, Estelle. My piece here is going to be quite brief, and it's not for the want of trying, but the government has parked a lot of the detail regarding the next Affordable Homes programme for now. But what have we learnt so far from the budget? £500 million top-up for the 21 to 26 AHP, and that is part of Labour's plan to unlock housing. The 500 million is going to top up the current programme to about 3.1 billion and supposedly deliver around 5,000 additional affordable homes. Not wholly convinced that 500 million is going to solve the housing crisis, but at least the Chancellor's first budget acknowledges the importance of housing as part of the government's wider plan to fix the foundations to deliver change and to rebuild Britain. A new housing strategy will be published next year, which will set out details of the new investment for the subsequent AHP, which we know is likely to focus particularly on social rent. Consequently, we don't know what the future holds for the funding of affordable rent or affordable home ownership products such as shared ownership. We will hear more by spring, and I suspect that our snapshot around then will practically write itself. And it really was that brief, my section, so I'm going to pass back to Estelle, who will cover some non-budget related capital funding guide changes.
Thank you. If you go on to the next slide. Thanks, JP. Very quickly, because we are almost out of time as well. As JP said, nothing to do with the budget, but I just wanted to highlight some amendments to the capital funding guide that were made last week. These relate to shared ownership, resales and subletting. I've put the relevant sections on the screen that have been updated. These are really about stronger guidance and clarification rather than radical changes, but I would suggest that you review your relevant policies and procedures to make sure that they are compliant with the capital funding guide. On subletting, basic principle remains that subletting of shared ownership homes is not allowed, but providers should consider requests for subletting where it arises from a genuine need on a case-by-case basis. These changes to the capital funding guide give some more guidance of the issues that you should consider when you get in a subletting request from a leaseholder. And it's made clear that information on your policies and approach to subletting must be readily available to your shared owners on your website. And on resales, capital funding guide has been revised to make it clearer that if you are unable to nominate during the nomination periods in the lease, the shared owner may sell their share of the property on the open market at a price below, above, or the same as the RICS valuation. Of course, if the sale is back-to-back staircasing, then the value of the share being staircased, that has to be subject to the RICS valuation. Again, there is a reminder in the capital funding guide that you should publish clear information about resale and valuation processes on your websites. And as a final heads up, Homes England have indicated that there will be updated key information documents coming soon, potentially next month. Back to you, JP, to round up.
Okay, thank you. And it's touch and go, but I think we've got time for one question. Katie, this is for you. Given the issues from Right to Buy, will Labour look to abolish Right to Buy entirely?
Thanks, JP. Whilst Angela Rayner's department has acknowledged that the system has its issues and that it needs to be fairer, the government has reassured us that right to buy isn't going to be completely scrapped anytime soon. It is going to face radical change, and I suspect that the model we have for right to buy in the next couple of years will look radically different to the one that was imposed 45 years ago. But we'll have to just keep watching this space for the moment.
All right. Thank you very much. And that brings us to an end of this month's snapshot, and indeed the end of our 2024 snapshot series, as we'll be pausing for the winter break. Thank you very much for joining us, and we will see you all in the new year.